The Frank G. Zarb School of Business and WRHU-FM Radio Hofstra University invite you inside the Z-Suite.
Hello, I'm Janet Lenihan, Dean of the Frank G. Zarb School of Business at Hofstra University. Welcome to Inside the Z-Suite, featuring current topics and talks with business leaders across every industry. From the playing field to the executive office, the number of women who have moved from the sidelines to front and center in all areas of the sports industry is on the rise. We've seen women like Serena Williams dominating tennis, Becky Hammon setting many firsts for women in the coaching ranks of the NBA, and even more women taking the lead in sports media, marketing, merchandising, and management. However, obstacles for women remain in this traditionally male-dominated arena. In fact, a recent study released by McKinsey & Company of approximately 1,700 women working in the sports business across North America revealed that women feel that the business trails all other industries in every dimension of inclusion. On this episode, Zarb School of Business Assistant Professor of Sports Management, Dr. Lauren Hindman, joins us to share her insights on the rise of women in the sports industry and the issues stalling progress. A graduate of the Eisenberg School of Management at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, her research examines the experiences of women and other marginalized individuals in organizations, and she has published in top journals, including 3 studies in the Journal of Sport Management, the premier journal in the field. With over a decade of professional experience in the sports industry, most recently as the Senior Director of Marketing for the American Hockey League's Texas Stars, Lauren brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussion. Welcome inside the Z-Suite, Lauren.
Thank you.
So let's start at the very beginning. Perhaps we can set the stage, if you will, for our discussion today and take a look at how far women have come in the sports industry. I mean, we certainly have made strides, but there's much more ground to cover. What has been the most significant barrier for women to overcome in the business?
I think just the presence in a lot of ways, right? When we think about it from a playing perspective, there are times not all that long ago where women weren't allowed to play sports, right? And we see that happening in the post-World War II era in England, for example, where women weren't allowed to play soccer. And that's not all that long ago to think about how far women's sports have come since then and how far women have come in the field of sports behind the scenes in the organizational context as well. There's just been a history of women not being in these spaces, and that's a really hard barrier to overcome. I think particularly when we think about it from this almost double discrimination standpoint, right, where we know that women are thought of as being less natural at leadership than men. And then you add the sport context on top of that, where women are seen as naturally being not as good at sport or naturally being not interested in sport. And it makes it really hard for women to find a space within the sport industry.
So you brought up the importance of role models for women in sports. You know, we still see, right, the lack of role models in these male-dominated fields. And in fact, there has been research where, you know, we ask youngsters to draw a scientist, and by and large, that scientist is drawn as a male, not a female. And so can you talk about who are the industry role models at the moment and groundbreakers?
I mean, I think starting with one of the groundbreakers who still remains a role model today has got to be Billie Jean King. From her playing days in tennis to her work with the Women's Sports Foundation, just everything she has done to advocate for women in the space of sports, I think that's been really important. I think Kim Ng, who was the first woman and the first Asian American woman to be the general manager in a men's major league professional sports organization, you know, seeing somebody like that be elevated to that type of position, even though when she earned that position, it was talked about she should have had that position years earlier because she was so overqualified for that role that it was beyond time. I think seeing that happen, though, especially in the men's sports space, is really important. And then lastly, I think right now, Dawn Staley, who's the head coach of the South Carolina women's basketball team, has been such a pioneer, such a groundbreaker, such an advocate for women. So many things that she's done, the least of which is not the fact that she advocated to be paid equal to the men's coach at South Carolina, getting this groundbreaking salary deal to become the highest paid coach in women's college basketball at a level that's comparable to what men coaches are making. That's just setting the ground. It's paving the way for so many other women in the sports space.
Salary, of course, is one of the biggest barriers, right? And inequities for women in many fields, right? Besides that example, are there others that you think will really help change that and close that gap?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen it happen in recent history with the U.S. women's national team on the soccer side of things, where they were advocating for that. And I think one of the things we're starting to see happen in some of these national team spaces is you're starting to get the athletes on the men's side coming to the table and also saying, this isn't right. And we're willing to give something up in order for women to be paid equitably. Because sometimes that is what it takes, right? There is a limited pie in terms of what these organizations have to spend. And if they're spending money on the men's and women's side, something does have to give if we're going to reach that space of equity. I don't think it's happening enough yet, but I think the more and more we see this happening, the more and more we'll take those baby steps towards becoming a place where women can be earning equal pay to men in this arena.
So important, right? And you've had firsthand experience working in sports. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience and maybe the obstacles that you faced and ways that you navigated those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, definitely my own experience working in the industry was what led me to go get my PhD and study and research in this space. Certainly, there were occasions where I experienced the kind of explicit sexist comments and harassment that you would expect a woman might get working, particularly in men's sports. To me, it was more about the daily interactions that I had and the more subtle and not necessarily intentionally harmful experiences that I had. So one example of that is that probably on a weekly basis, I would encounter someone in the context of my job who would ask me how I got my job and whether I was a sports fan. The funny thing was when I spoke with a male colleague who was at the same level in the organization with me and I was relating this experience to him, and he's like, I have never once had anyone ask me that question. Funny thing was we were working for a hockey team and he wasn't a hockey fan because you don't need to be a fan to work in these spaces, right? You need to be good at your job. You need to be good at marketing or selling tickets or whatever it is. But there's just this assumption and this constant questioning that's happening when there's a woman in this space because you're seen as kind of this anomaly or this invader of a men's space.
Well, it's interesting, in that McKinsey study, they actually reported that women are 2.8 times more likely to leave their job when they don't feel included.
Yeah.
And certainly while the industry should want to make changes to recruit and retain women, what are some of the things that women can do who find themselves in spaces like you were to feel included?
Part of it is being open about the experiences you're having and whether that's with the women that you're working with. And in some cases, you might not have many, if any, women colleagues. Sometimes it can be with those women. Other times it can be with the men you're working with too, right? Having that conversation with my colleague opened up the conversation across many people in our organization to start having this and talking about the fact that the women in our office were having a completely different work experience than the men. The men that we work with, right, a lot of this wasn't even coming from them. A lot of it was coming from our fans or our media partners or our sponsors. And so to find that the men in our space actually were very supportive of us and were willing to think about this stuff a little more deeply. The problem is, unless we talk about it, they're not aware of it because it's not their lived experience. They're not seeing that happen. So I think finding your people, whoever they may be, so that you can talk about the experiences, hopefully finding advocates in leadership roles who can make that change and be willing to protect you. I know we had a situation with two of our women working in ticket sales where there was a fan who was being harassing to them, and our organization banned those fans. And that's not something that's always going to happen, right? Because money talks. And when you're banning fans, that means you're losing money. To have an organization willing to step in and say, this is not okay, and we're going to protect our employees is really important.
Leadership matters, right?
Yeah,
it always
definitely
does, and it builds culture. Culture is what drives inclusivity and people feeling that they belong. We can't not talk about the most, I would say, influential person in women's sports at the moment, which is, of course, Caitlin Clark, and the effect that she is having on the WNBA. I mean, in a short time, she's elevated the visibility of the sport. The league recently announced that this past May, it had the highest attended opening month in over 20 years, with many of those those games being complete sellouts. Viewership across all of the league's broadcasts and streaming platforms is up, including among young viewers, which is a critical market they're looking to capture. Even their merch sales, right? Their merchandise sales are setting records, with the WNBA store reportedly registering the highest single season in sales in their history. Talk to us about what is the impact of her influence, and do you think the surge in interest and support for women's sports is here to stay?
I definitely think it's here to stay. I think that we can't deny the impact that Caitlin Clark has had, especially these past couple of seasons in college basketball and now into the WNBA season. She's bringing that attention, she's bringing the viewership, she's bringing the ticket sales across the board. That is absolutely true. But we also have to understand that this was happening in the context of women's sports already being on the rise. You know, it's in the context of just 2-3 years ago, the NCAA being called out for the gender inequities in the way that they were running the March Madness tournaments and their championship tournaments overall. And we've seen structural changes happen since then that have happened alongside this rise in women's basketball's popularity these past 2 seasons. I can't deny that impact as well. And I think also when we look beyond women's basketball, we saw just last year women's volleyball in Nebraska selling out a football stadium for a women's volleyball game, right? This is not something that's an anomaly. We are going to see this recurring. We're going to see that continued growth. I think the biggest challenge has been the structures weren't ready for it, right? The media was not ready for this. The sponsorship, the investment was not ready for this popularity in women's sports. Prior to these past couple of seasons in particular, if you wanted to be a women's sports fan, you had to fight to find women's sports to watch, right? You can't just turn on the TV or go into a bar and catch a women's sports game in the same way. And now we're starting to see a lot more storytelling around these athletes because we're getting more media attention. There's some negatives that are coming along with that because, again, the structures aren't quite ready for this surge yet. But I think it's only good things. I think we're going to see it continue, and I'm really excited to see it go beyond just the attention on Caitlin Clark to really focus on all of these athletes and what they can do.
You know, it's so true. When I was a youngster, I played basketball. When I wanted to go see a women's league game, you just walked in. There was plenty of seats, and there was no issues getting a ticket. And now you want to get a ticket to see Caitlin Clark, It's difficult to come by, right? Before we talk a little bit further about her, I just want to pick up on what you said, that there's some negatives, right? That the structures weren't ready. Talk a little bit about that.
So one of the things we're seeing on the media coverage side of things right now is we're seeing a lot of sports journalists who have never covered women's sports, who have never paid close attention to women's sports. But now, because everybody's talking about it, they're being asked to cover it and talk about it as well. And we see them coming into this space very ill-prepared. They don't know the history. They don't know the players beyond Caitlin Clark. And so sometimes the insight and analysis they're giving is harmful, is hurtful. And that's caused a lot of controversy. It's caused a lot of conflict, particularly with primarily women in the sports media space who have been doing this work, who have been covering the WNBA and other women's sports for so long, where now they're having to push back against these voices.
Speaking of controversy, certainly Caitlin Clark has brought a lot of controversy to the game, notably among her own fellow athletes. In her first few months in the WNBA, questions have been raised about the influence of racial bias in coverage of Clark versus other players, as well as whether players are physically targeting her on the court. And so it really just raises the question, will these controversies sideline all of the hard work and gains that women have made in sports, or do you think it's going to be a catalyst for change?
I think it can be a catalyst for change. I also think that in a lot of ways, controversy can be good in terms of establishing women's sports for what they are and normalizing being a fan of women's sports. We're acting right now in this space like men's sports is without controversy, when in fact it's the controversy that drives the coverage, right? That drives fan interest. And so I think the fact that we're talking about the controversies, that's a good sign. That's a good thing. I think it also, particularly when we talk about issues related to the racial bias that we're seeing in media coverage and fan reactions to Caitlin Clark, especially in comparison to other players in the league like Angel Reese, I think the fact that we're having these conversations hopefully can be a catalyst for change to eliminate some of that bias, or at least bring awareness to it. Women's sports is not a pristine space. It's had controversy all along, but because it hadn't been reported on in the same way, we just don't know about it. And I think maybe we expect, because of our gender stereotypes, that women are less controversial and aren't physical and don't have beef with each other. And that's simply not the case. And so I think the fact that we're having those conversations, hopefully that normalizes it, and we'll continue to get more interest in people following these athletes in this league.
The gender stereotypes, right, are so broad and so entrenched in what we do. And so, that word normalize, I think, is so critically important. We're still at a point where often when a woman gets into a leadership role, it's prefaced with the first. She's the first. Mm-hmm. What do you think it'll take to get beyond that in all aspects of the business of sports, where women's contributions are commonplace? They're expected. They're not unique. They're not special. They are woven into the fabric of what we do.
I think it's a place that feels so far away right now because, like you said, every time we're seeing something, the first woman referee in the Super Bowl, the first woman to be behind the bench at an NHL team, whatever it might be, right? We're still in this space of firsts. So it feels in some ways like it's far away. I think a lot of it is the normalization of it. I think a lot of it is the continued presence of women in these spaces. I'm hopeful that the elevation of the athletes is going to help in other areas as well, where we're going to start seeing these women for athletes in their own right without having to constantly compare them to men and to men's sports and men's leagues, but letting them exist in their own right and for their own worth. I think that's a hard challenge. Our entire world is organized around this gender binary of having this ideological hierarchy of men being naturally above women, right? It takes a lot to break that down. It's not easy work, and I don't think it can happen just in the sports space. It's got to be a broader societal change. I think the more we see it, the more we see that presence, the more we talk about it and can see women being successful in these spaces, the easier it'll be for the women that follow.
I couldn't agree more. And it goes back to our earlier point about role models, right? Being able to see women succeed in male-dominated fields actually will help propel younger women to see themselves and to be able to follow that trajectory. So critically important. Some of our listeners are going to be young students starting their careers in the sports field. Do you have any particular advice for them as the structures are still emerging and those challenges still exist and the barriers, unfortunately, are still there?
Yeah.
What's some tips you can give to them?
I think number one is know your worth. Know that you belong, that you deserve to be there. Even in the times where you might feel like you're questioning your worth, your value, your contribution, you're questioning what other people think of you, just know your own worth. As I mentioned earlier, find your people. Find the people that you can turn to. Hopefully there's some of those folks in your organization. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's external mentors, colleagues, people that you go through school with, faculty, former bosses, whoever it might be. Find those people who you can turn to when you are struggling, where you can talk things out with them. And then also I would say recognize that bad experiences in workplaces is never okay. We're doing a research study right now where we found that women normalize some of the harassing behaviors they experience from men in these workplaces because they expect it. And right, we've talked about some of it today. They go into these jobs expecting it, and so then they put up with it. And I think that we really need to stop putting up with it. And if you can't find success in advocating yourself in the organization, that organization is going to protect you, that's not an organization you want to work for. And I would encourage you to not be afraid to make your voice heard, even if that means leaving a particularly bad job, right? Leave that job, find another organization. I think that's the way we'll really push for change.
That is such great advice, right? For not just women in the sports industry, for all women and for all marginalized communities, right? Being your own advocate, finding allies, finding mentors, and having a voice and walking away when it's not a good place for you to be successful. Great advice, Lauren. One final group of questions we have that we do here at Inside the Z-Suite. Following in the spirit of Bernard Pivot, these are quick questions that I'm going to ask for just one-word answers, very short answers, just off the top of your head. They're just a fun little group of questions that we like to ask all our guests. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. If you could trade places with anyone or anything, who, what would it be and why?
Maybe Simone Biles. I took gymnastics for an entire year as a child, but I think being at that elite level of an athlete experience would be a great opportunity to walk in those shoes.
Awesome. That's terrific. So what's your favorite work or household chore?
I like to bake and decorate cookies. So my favorite thing is decorating Christmas cookies and sending them out with my gifts every year.
Ah, that's terrific. I like to eat cookies. What's your least favorite chore?
Doing the dishes, for sure.
Wonderful. And final question. What are the most impactful words of wisdom someone has ever shared with you?
Taking things one day at a time, controlling what you can control. So I think that that's always really important. There's a lot of things that happen to us in life, whether it's professionally or personally, that are unexpected, and you're always having to pivot. And if you stay in that place of wanting to be worried about what the next thing that's going to come at you is, it can be really hard to focus on moving forward. So I think focusing on what you can control is what I try to pay attention to.
Terrific advice. So thank you again to sports management professor and industry insider Lauren Hindman for joining us to talk about the rise, influence, and trajectory of women working in the sports industry. Thanks also to our show's producer, Adrian Stoller, and WRHU audio engineer, John Mullen. Be sure to tune in each week on the radio and online to WRHU 88.7 Hofstra University for a new episode of Inside the Z-Suite, or catch up with our show wherever you enjoy your podcasts. For more information about this program and more about the Zarb School of Business, please visit hofstra.edu/business. Until next time, I'm Janet Lenihan from Inside the Z-Suite.